Recording this meeting. Great, thanks for kicking that off. So first, I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining us, and thank you in advance for your input on our clean energy standard work. My name is Will Space. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for Climate Programs at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. I have with me several colleagues that are involved in the program. One is Assistant Commissioner Christine Kirby. I also have Emily Lamb and Jason Brown, who work directly with me on the Clean Heat Standard implementation process. We're going to be talking today about a number of potential changes to our Clean Energy Standard regulation, but I wanted to start by emphasizing this is not a proposed regulation or anything of that nature at this point. This is an informal stakeholder consultation to stimulate discussion. So we'll listen to your comments and then look at next steps. But before I dive into the content, I'm going to turn it over to Emily for a brief logistics update.
Thanks, Will. We can go to the next slide. So as Will mentioned, this meeting is being recorded. To minimize background noise, we ask that all participants stay on mute. And we'd ask you to please enter your full name and affiliation if relevant in the participants panel. You can change your name by going to your name in the participants panel and hovering over it, and there'll be an option to rename yourself. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about how to participate in the meeting. So in the latter half of the meeting, we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments. If you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment, you can raise your hand, and when it's your turn, we'll notify you and ask you to unmute yourself. You can also submit questions or comments in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it back to Will.
Great. Thanks, Emily. And the only logistical note I would add is it's easier for us if people hold off until the discussion time at the end to enter questions in the chat, because sometimes it helps to listen through the whole thing to structure a question and helps us to manage a response. So if you can accommodate that would help us, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the content of our presentation. First, briefly to summarize what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the Clean Energy Standard in general and also what we're working on right now. Then we're going to talk about some potential changes. A couple of them are in broad categories. One is strengthening the standard, in other words, making the standard better able to drive or incent the production of clean electricity, which is the purpose of the standard. And the second is to improve the ability of the Clean Energy Standard to provide comprehensive accounting of our clean energy that we're crediting in the program. There's some complexities now that complicate that. And then we have a couple other options to talk about also, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps for submitting written comments. Next slide. Thank you. So first, by way of background, most of you are likely familiar with this, but the Clean Energy Standard has been around since 2018, and it sets a minimum percentage as a portfolio standard. Sets a minimum percentage that must come from new clean energy sources. It's related to our Renewable Portfolio Standard program, which is the Department of Energy Resources, in that the compliance with that standard counts toward the Clean Energy Standard. It's different, though, in that the Clean Energy Standard has a higher standard, so it encourages additional clean energy, and it's not limited as far as eligibility to just the technologies that are eligible under the Renewable Portfolio Standard. It's broader to accommodate things like, in practice, hydropower, and in theory, other low emission technologies like nuclear or potentially carbon sequestration on a power plant. We added to the Clean Energy Standard in 2020 by adding this component called what we call the CES, or the existing part of it, which is to get at the clean energy that is that was already existing before we started the Clean Energy Standard. We don't want the new clean energy to just displace existing clean energy. So that CES component includes things like some of the regional existing nuclear power and also some of the imported hydropower from Canada. And an important aspect of the Clean Energy Standard is that it actually sets standards, numerical standards, every year out through 2050. And you can see in the graph the components of the different contributors to the clean energy standard, but it does get a pretty good way toward a full clean energy standard of it's not to 100%, but up around 90% in 2030, and then stays pretty constant. As you look at that, though, remember that's a time when we expect electricity demand to be increasing due to electrification, so it's not a kind of constant amount of energy. So that's kind of the background of the clean energy standard. Next slide. So the next topic I wanted to provide, and the idea of background is sort of a reason why we're raising these topics at this time. The Clean Energy Standard Regulation actually requires us to do a program review, or required it in 2021. And the reason for that timing was that in the Global Warming Solutions Act, there was a climate plan that was due at the end of 2020. So the idea was to have a program review after that was completed. But since that time, there have been changes to the underlying legislation, and we've published additional clean energy and climate plans and also additional emission limits. So it seemed appropriate to kind of supplement that earlier program review with some options for how we might strengthen the clean energy standard to best meet the needs of the climate plans that have been published. So that's kind of why we're here, the basic background. We go ahead now and dive into the different topics. And I said there is some overlap, so we'll hold questions until the end, but I'll go through. There's about 10 different potential changes that I'm going to talk about. So next slide includes the first of those. So the first set of standards are about strengthening the standard. And by strengthening the standard, we mean make the standard better able to incent additional clean energy. So the basic concept here is that we have this concept of an alternative compliance payment in the clean energy standard, and it requires the delivery of it requires a payment if there isn't enough clean energy certificates submitted for compliance. And the way that's structured now, the funds that are collected aren't sort of inherently used within the standard concept. They can be used by other things. So we're thinking about a potential change to the way the ACP program works within the regulation that would direct the ACP payments more toward things that for the goals of the clean energy standard. So one of those, basically the idea is that if an ACP happens, that means that there may not have been enough supply of clean energy in one year. So we might want to hold on to those ACP payments or use them to increase the amount of clean energy even above the standard in a future year. And we floated a couple of concepts for doing that. And one of those is that we would actually have some sort of a grant program where when we had those ACP funds, we would give grants to new projects in exchange for rights to any certificates later on. And the second concept is just that we would basically hold on to the payments to create a fund to purchase clean energy certificates in a future year when they're available at lower prices. And both of those would help to support provide some certainty around the market for clean energy certificates, because they would tend to create more expectation there would be demand in the future. And that would tend to strengthen the program. I should pause at this point. I realize as I was speaking that there's one thing I didn't mention in the background, that the ideas on these slides, in addition to these slides, are laid out in a narrative discussion document on our website that includes the same information. So we urge you to look over that also as you're thinking about how to react to this information. Next slide. So the second topic under strengthening the standard is just simply to increase this ACP rate. So different programs in New England have different alternative compliance payment rates, which set the maximum amount that the market is going to be willing to pay for the clean energy certificates versus making a payment of the alternative compliance payment. So raising the rate could have a couple of impacts. One is that it would tend to increase the general market price of clean energy over time, and that would tend to support development of additional clean energy kind of incrementally put more incentive into the overall program. It also would address an issue that is apparent in the chart on the right, where if our Massachusetts programs bring more supply into the region of clean energy, because the clean energy standard certificate ACP rate is lower, people may choose to comply with other jurisdictions' requirements sort of before they comply with the clean energy standard and make payments to us. And that may not be a desirable outcome for Massachusetts. So that's the second idea for strengthening the standard and making it better able to incent clean energy as we need under our Global Warming Solutions Act. Next slide. So the third topic is to deal with the fact, by way of context, that the clean energy standard gives an incentive for generating clean energy over the life of a project. And it doesn't really differentiate between the early costs of starting up a project versus the operational costs, which can be very low for a clean energy project. So that may not be perfectly aligned with the economics of clean energy. So one thing we've thought about is what we're calling a recent vintage requirement that would have a separate requirement that some fraction of each year's compliance obligation be met with clean energy credits or certificates from newer projects, in the case we floated here of the past 3 years. And that would have a higher ACP amount, and that would really encourage a focus on getting new projects online and making sure the economics are there to do that, versus the current structure, which focuses more on the operational costs over the life of the project, or at least payments over the life of a project. So that's the third item. And then the fourth item is about strengthening the standard. And the fourth of the items about strengthening the standard is a long-term planning concept. So we know that there's some uncertainty inherently in markets, including markets like the ones that are created by our standards. So we might add, in theory, some form of a planning requirement to our regulations that would require that the compliance entities actually either just somehow make plans in general, or even enter into some sort of contracts over time to ensure a long-term supply. And related to that is the idea of possibly creating some sort of an organized market for those long-term contracts or other processes for purchasing clean energy. And it's worth mentioning at this point, I think, that some of these ideas are related to a concept you might have heard of last year, which was there was discussion of a forward clean energy market, and some of the ideas in this are kind of follow along from that work. So that concludes the first part of the list of options, which is about strengthening the standard. And again, these options so far are designed to better align the clean energy standard with its important job of actually incentivizing or encouraging or bringing online new clean energy that we need to meet the requirements of our Global Warming Solutions Act. On to the next slide. So the next topic is sort of trying to bring order to something that has become a little bit complicated about the clean energy standard, which is that the clean energy standard is expressed as a percentage. And so, for example, in 2030, there's a kind of headline percentage of 60% of the energy must be clean for the clean energy standard, ignoring the CES part of it. But that doesn't fully reflect all the moving parts around clean energy that are implicated in the clean energy standard. So the first issue that I'm going to talk about related to this, that some of you may be familiar with, is that the clean energy standard does allow use for compliance, the same as the renewable energy standards, generation from solar installations that are not metered directly as electricity production. They're behind the meter. And so that rooftop generation gets kind of counted toward compliance in the certificate market, but it's not the electricity that's used on site isn't counted as used electricity in the calculation of the compliance obligations. So you end up with a case where if you have this extra energy that's used behind the meter that's in the accounting because of the certificates, but it's not in the accounting as far as calculating the standard. So a potential change to deal with this would be to make some sort of an adjustment to the compliance obligation to reflect this. So for example, if we think, and we would need to do some sort of a study, but if we think 5% of the total electricity consumption in the state is in this not metered status, then we might make electricity sellers adjust the compliance obligation up by 5% to match that. And we've had some internal discussions about how to think about this. For me, it's a little similar to the adjustment that's made for the line losses in the calculations around the clean energy standard and renewable portfolio standard, in the sense that this is energy that is electricity that's used in Massachusetts, but it's not directly metered at the customer level. So there may need to be some sort of adjustment for that to make sure we're getting our percentage standard right. Next slide. So the next idea around making the accounting more comprehensive is to deal with the CES and CESE in a more kind of self-consistent way. So there's two parts of the clean energy standard. One is the what we sort of sometimes refer as just the clean energy standard, which is the one that deals with new generation, and it's fixed as a certain percentage of load every year. The CESE for existing resources percentage is different. It varies based on changes of electricity sales. And the idea is, since we were trying to keep the amount, the contribution from the existing resources constant in their amount, if it was a percentage, then as the electricity sales increase, it would change. So we made this adjustment where, say, if the electricity sales double, then the CESE percentage is cut in half to kind of keep the amount of electricity the same. But that creates a complication that, since the CES and the CESE are additive, for example, in the 2030 60% example, I said, we don't know at this point what the CESE amount is going to be, since we don't know the load. So we can't fix exactly the total amount of the standard. And this, like the last example I talked about, isn't much of an issue when you're talking about a lower standard, like have been historically the case, where you talk about less than half. But if you start getting toward really higher percentages, then it starts to make a difference. So we thought one way we might deal with that is, if we, instead of making the two things added, we might set a total supply standard of a certain percentage. In the example here, it might be 95% in some year. And then we would calculate the CESE, and remember, that's 4 years in advance. And if that comes out to be 22%, then we'd go back and set the CES standard at the remaining amount. And we think that might be an orderly way to allow us to fix the standard at a high percentage without overly complicating things. Next slide. So the next one is about how Class 2 hydropower is included in the calculation. And we do not include Class 2 hydropower in the CESE right now, because we didn't need to replicate RPS Class 2. You know, it's not that we don't think it's clean energy, and we also don't want to, since that's a kind of existing energy sources, we don't want to increase the amount of those eligible resources that are being counted toward Massachusetts, because they may be counted in other states, or there may be other reasons. So but on the other hand, this creates, since there is this percentage that's contributed by the Class 2 hydro of a few percent each year, it creates a situation where we need to kind of add that on to the clean energy standard quantity to get the total amount. So we thought one way to deal with that might be to just basically count certificates that are actually submitted for compliance toward RPS class 2 toward the CES compliance percentage, and then we need to increase the standard accordingly. I want to make clear we wouldn't be talking about allowing those resources to contribute without limit. We'd simply be for an accounting purpose, not to change the incentives or anything, including this in the total standard. Next slide. So the last one, and this is about accounting. It's also a little bit more substantive than the others that are about accounting, which is to, I think many have observed that the portfolio standards and the CES specifically don't address the need to generate electricity at the time it's used. And we have things like a clean peak standard that can deal to some extent with this, and particularly by supporting battery storage, but also other eligible options. But fundamentally, there may be a advantage to having an incentive that is more aligned with when, at least seasonally, the electricity is needed. So there's a couple options here. One of them comes from the Forward Clean Energy discussion last year, which is to simply exclude during periods of negative pricing, or maybe zero pricing, but we suggested negative here, when that means that there's a lot of extra clean energy already. We wouldn't give any clean energy certificates during those times, and that would have some complexities around implementation, but we think it could be manageable within the systems we have. The other one that also may be in a similar category and would have a bigger impact would be actually have a quarterly or even a monthly compliance obligation, so that the electricity sellers would need to demonstrate that, at least on a monthly basis, the electricity was being generated in the same month that it was being used, or close to in the quarterly example, seasonally anyway. So that concludes the second category of potential changes, which have to do with sort of the way the clean energy standard accounts for the different contributors to clean energy and the use of energy over time. So there's a couple other ideas here that didn't fit in either category, but we thought we wanted to be comprehensive about things that we might improve. So if we can go on to the next slide. So there's a couple other options. One is to just update the eligibility criteria. The current eligibility for the clean energy standard is based on an emission threshold that came out of the Renewable Portfolio Standard program a number of years ago, in the way it deals with biomass. And that standard is pretty stringent. It says you take the most efficient natural gas powered facility on a life cycle basis, and you compare it to your clean energy, and it needs to be half as much emissions as that efficient natural gas fired power plant. However, since that time, that started to seem like maybe not sufficient. And EPA has also come up with a standard for natural gas power plants where they need to capture 90% of their emissions in certain cases. So what we've thought of doing instead is to we would take and this bullet, I think, I'm saying that I'm going to clarify a little bit, which is that what you would do is you'd take the EPA standards and you'd take a hypothetical new power plant that meets that EPA standard with the 90% carbon capture, and then you would figure out the life cycle emissions of that, or we would, and the clean energy would need to be cleaner than that, or at least as clean as that to qualify. And that would also deal with when the legislature made some changes around biomass eligibility in the RPS Class 1 program. Those changes made it impossible, given the way the Clean Energy Standard regulation is written, for biomass to qualify into the clean energy standard, but that's not as clearly stated as it could be in the clean energy standard regulation. So we could consider being explicit around that, although it's quite unlikely that a biomass facility would meet the numerical standard I just described in any case, so that might not be necessary. I think we have one more slide. So the last option is what we're calling a just transition fee, which is generally to take our approach we've been taking across all our programs to try and think about how to build equity into the programs and apply it here. And the idea here is that some clean energy sources clearly contribute to equity by, for example, being cited in a community that is low income or otherwise has some identified equity characteristic that we want to support, and others that don't. So what you might do is have some sort of a fee associated with clean energy facilities that don't contribute meaningfully to equity goals that you could use to support clean energy that does contribute to equitable goals. And we haven't done a lot of work on the nuts and bolts of how that would be implemented, but the basic idea is you might have a fee at the compliance deadline that would come in for use of those credits for compliance, or you might do it somewhere else in the process. So I think that concludes the list. Just to make sure, Jason, I'll have to go to the next slide. Yep, don't see anything else there. So we'll come back and emphasize at the end. It looks like we have something missing from this slide. Maybe Emily, you can fill it in. It says submit comments by date. I think we do have a deadline that we've put out. Is that right?
Yes, by January 19th.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
So by January 19th, and I think that's in the discussion document. Is that right, Emily?
Yes, it's in the discussion document and up on the website.
Okay, great. So we are mostly, we think that most likely we're going to get the bulk of our comments here in writing by that deadline. You're welcome to make comments today, but I think the major goal for the rest of this is to hear from you all, whether you have technical questions or clarifications that I can provide about some of these ideas that would help you to comment meaningfully. As I said, you're also welcome to actually comment at this time also. So that concludes my presentation. I think we have a chat that's available to people to insert questions or comments, although I haven't seen any yet. I hope that's enabled. We're also willing to unmute people if that works better. Is the chat, I don't see anything in the chat. Yes, I see a question there. So the slides are online. Thank you for that question. Yeah, the slides are already posted along with the discussion document I mentioned, and that also, good to see the chat. So does anybody I went through a lot of material online. I think since things are coming in now, I can probably just read them, and Emily, I may need your help if we get more, but we haven't given really any thought about timeline or where we might end up to this point. We are really just looking for initial comments on whether these are good ideas to pursue at this point. I also have a question about where the alternative compliance payments go, and there is, within the regulation now, there's a specification about where those payments go. It's fairly broad, though. They go into the general, what's called the Climate Mitigation Trust, and those have been used for a variety of good climate-related purposes so far. Looks like Larry wants to speak. I think we could go ahead and do that now by unmuting him.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Larry Cretion, Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And I want to begin by saying you're a busy person, and so everybody else at DEP is, and I appreciate the work you're doing. There's other things going on besides this great idea. First of all, we really love and support a couple key parts of what you're proposing. In our view, Massachusetts will not reach its goal for 2030 of 50% greenhouse gas reduction with the policies that we have currently in place. I think there are a lot of ideas that the administration's working on that could get us there that have to be executed, and I think this is one of them. We need to reduce emissions 50% by 2030. When the last review of the Clean Energy Standard, we supported changes like what you're proposing today. And the Clean Energy and Climate Plan should have been more explicit calling for these things. So we particularly support increasing the alternative compliance payment. It didn't make sense to drop it, and now it makes sense to do what you're suggesting. We also would like to have a little more clarity about where those dollars are going to go. I think that was a question somebody else put in the chat, and how they would be put into the market, which entity would be responsible. And then what we really support is the manner in which you're accounting for behind the meter generation. We have a lot of behind the meter generation in Massachusetts, a lot more than a few years ago. We're going to have a lot more 5-10 years from now. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when somebody puts solar on their roof and it's behind the meter, it actually somewhat cuts into the Clean Energy Standard obligation basis. So we're not getting quite as much clean energy as we think we're getting, even though we want that behind the meter solar. So by making this adjustment, I think we're looking at maybe increasing the overall standard effectively by about 5% now, but that will grow over time as we add behind the meter generation, I think. So fully support that. I think if with that and increasing the ACP, I think it's going to provide a measurable impact on our goals to greenhouse gas reduction. If you have any forecast for that, we'd love to see it. But that honestly, that would help us generate more support among people who are concerned about that. But I think you probably could put a number to it. Now, we respectfully disagree with a couple of points. Well-intended, great ideas.
Larry,
I'm sorry.
I hate to interrupt because I wanted to just to ask. You mentioned more clarity on where the dollars go for the ACPs, and we're asking for comment on that. We have a couple of ideas, so I just want to make sure you are aware of that, and we'd be happy to take your comments on that, either today or in comments. So thank you.
Well, I basically just think that DEP and DOER and the Clean Energy Center all do great work. I just think things are a little bit complicated for those of us who are in the marketplace, and having some clarity and coordination among the agencies would be important. So, there's no wrong answer, I don't think, but, there probably would probably get to something that would be probably easier to administer and simpler, so people think about where they might go for those resources. So I'm kind of open-minded, to be honest with you, but the more those of us who are in the marketplace, it gets really confusing about what you do versus what DOER and the Clean Energy Center does.
Thank you.
Larry, maybe we'll come back to you because I have a related question to this in the chat, and I think you were going to maybe go to a different thing. So just briefly, there's another question about the spending of ACP dollars, and I want to just emphasize the particular concept we're talking about here is that we would revise our regulation to sort of target and limit, provide assurance that the funds would be used in one of two particular ways. One of them would be through some sort of maybe a competitive grant program where we would say, if you're a clean energy supplier and you want to come to us and apply for these ACP funds, we will, look at those grants and, maybe make payments based on milestones or something. And the assumption there is that then we would have some rights. We would have sort of paid for the certificates when they come on later on. And that would create some additional demand in the overall market later on. Also, that might be, beneficial to our other clean energy. And then a variation on that is that we would simply, one of the problems with financing clean energy in relation to these standards is it's hard to be sure that the prices of the certificates won't fall in the future. So that's a risk that you take. So the other option was to hold the funds that we get for the ACP in some sort of a fund that we could only use to buy certificates at a later time when they were at lower prices. And even if that time never came, that would tend to make the market more confident that prices wouldn't fall in the future because there was additional demand for certificates later. So I hear some general discussions. I just wanted to kind of focus and put a finer point on the two particular things that we're interested in comment on. So Larry, I guess since I think you had a little more to go, so I'll go back to you, and then we have some other things in the chat, but I think we might as well finish up.
Yeah, thank you. Real briefly, the just transition fee. That is what we all need to have is make this transition to clean energy just. And so we generally support the creation of those kinds of things, whether it's a clean heat standard or this. But our quibble here is funds for that should be on fossil fuels, not on clean energy. We really should not be increasing the cost of clean energy, clean electricity. So you're doing great work on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which some people are not aware of, maybe several people here, but that's where to go, which is to look for the funds to support something like a just transition fee. So it's on oil, coal, and gas, not on all the sources of clean energy that would meet the clean energy standard. Finally, adding a timing component to the standard, I just think the complexity of that is not necessarily going to be worth it. And I also think that I think we can manage well when energy prices go low. That is the time to charge up my electric car or stationary storage. And that's the better way to balance the grid, I think, than trying to make a complicated system that generators have to adapt to meet the clean energy standard. So I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I just think it's a bigger issue that probably requires some further thought. So thank you very much we will submit comments by the 19th in writing.
Great. Thanks, Larry. And it looks like, I think, Jason, we have another person that wanted to speak. We could go ahead and do that now, and then I'll get back to the list in the chat.
Hi, this is Brandon Kibbe with Great River Hydro. I had a specific question. First of all, thank you very much for all the work that you guys are doing on this, and I'm glad to see that we have an opportunity here to revisit the clean energy standard. You know, we are owners of large conventional hydropower located here in New England, and we're very interested when clean energy standard, particularly the CES regulations, were promulgated. And you know, our generation is among a little over 1,000 megawatts of existing conventional hydropower. And when I say conventional hydropower, I mean not pump storage hydropower that's located here in New England, that are all greater than 30 megawatts in size and interconnected here domestically. These units are too large to qualify for Mass RPS Class 2s. You know, there's a 7.5 megawatt cap on Mass Class 2s. But they would otherwise qualify for the Mass CES designation. But however, there is a regulation, or within the regulation, there is a restriction, which is 310 CMR 7.75 7C item number 2, and I'll read it here just to quote it. The amount of electrical output of a clean existing generation unit that qualifies as clean existing generation shall be the second lowest annual amount of megawatt hours that did not have attributes retired, claimed, or used represented as part of electrical energy output of sales or used to satisfy obligations in any jurisdiction other than Massachusetts in the years 2016 through 2018, as reflected in NEPOOL GIS. What's interesting is that this restriction basically says if you've participated in other RPS market elsewhere in New England, you don't qualify. And these large hydro units to a unit would have qualified in Vermont or Maine or other jurisdictions under existing RPS standards in those states. So therefore, that 1,000 plus megawatts of hydro, that's domestic, that is generating existing clean energy resources and clean energy here in New England are disqualified because they sold in those RPS markets. The question we always had is, RPS markets in New England are regional. Many units qualify for multiple different jurisdictions for those REC markets, and they compete regionally. But those environmental attributes can only ever be retired once. So if I have a REC that's qualified in Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts, and we sell it to a counterparty, that counterparty can retire it in one of those markets, but only one of those markets. And it's counted only once. Why not let the clean energy standard existing extend to other units that would otherwise qualify for it and let it compete in the regional marketplace and remove that restriction? And that's what we would recommend. And we think that restriction is sort of arbitrary, and it's unnecessarily limiting the participation in the CES market. And really think if we just struck that, you would get at least 1,000 megawatts of other units to at least potentially qualify for CES.
Yeah, so thank you for that comment, and I will acknowledge that that's not one of the changes that we floated, but we are open for comment on anything people think we should change about the clean energy standard. I will just briefly address the rationale for the way the regulation is now structured. I think that we found it's a little bit easier to think about when you think about the regional nuclear power plants, which also have electricity that qualifies under the CES. And we've limited the contribution of those nuclear power plants because we were concerned that if we allowed sort of all of the output of some of those nuclear plants to come into the CES, that what would happen is that would show a reduction of emissions in Massachusetts because we'd be assigning the nuclear output for Massachusetts, but it wouldn't be any change in the clean energy in the region. And so we described that in some of our older background documents as shuffling. Certainly the issue wouldn't be as acute with the smaller hydro, but the reasoning was the same. We felt like if there was anything that had really been in the past assigned somewhere else, that moving forward to assign it to Massachusetts was not something we wanted to recognize as something that was going to reduce emissions. But I'm simply providing the original rationale. It's been I think there's been debate about it all along, and we're happy to hear the comments you just gave again in writing and at this meeting. So that's helpful. So back to the written chat, just in the interest of completeness, I'm going to read a couple things that are just comments, I think. Again, I'm quoting from the chat. Just so everyone knows, these programs represent roughly a 4% tax on customers' energy bill. And then it says RECs as a whole represent about 40% of retail energy bills. Another question we have is, in thinking about raising the ACP, has DEP considered how the balance and increase in affordability? Any increase to ACP ultimately impact customers, ratepayers? I think the answer is certainly that is the reason that there is an ACP, is to limit those costs. So we have thought about that. I think that in particular, aligning with the regional ACPs is a relatively small change that could have a significant impact on how the accounting works. Certainly a big increase in the ACP would require some additional work that we haven't yet done. I think, as I said, we're just trying to get additional interest in those topics at this point. And I see an edit to the 30% from 40% of the costs that are associated with RECs also in the comments. So any other clarifications? Again, I think the main purpose here is we do expect to get written comments on these, and we want to help you if we're not explaining what we're thinking about to ask these questions so that we can help you understand. Is there any conversation with DOR adjusting the Class 1 ACP? Seems counterintuitive. The original argument to raise the CES and not Class 1. So that is true that historically the RPS has always had a higher ACP than CES. we certainly are in communications with the other agencies about this. They're aware that we're having these conversations, and as I said, these are just preliminary at this point. So we would, when we get input, come back and have those conversations some more. Next is, do you have an estimate on the megawatts of projects that would qualify to deliver if ACP arrays? And the answer is no, we do not have that analysis at this time. All right, anything else? I'll pause a little more. I think, and Emily, I think I've gotten through everything in chat. I don't know if somebody else has been checking my work on that, but.
Yeah, I think you've addressed everything in the chat.
I'm not seeing any additional questions or requests to speak at this time.
Great, well, last call then. Okay, then to close things out, we are requesting comments by a particular date, which is January 19th. There's an email address here to email those comments, and there's also more information on our Clean Energy Standard website, including these slides and discussion document. So with that, I'll thank everybody for your participation, and we'll sign off. Thank you.